Hi everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for taking time out of your busy day to join us. I'd like to welcome you to the second session of our Risk Management 101 series. Today's topic is conducting your risk analysis. Let's go over a couple of things before we dive into our discussion. This session is being recorded, and all attendees will be receiving a link to the recording, as well as a copy of the slides following the presentation. All attendees will be muted throughout the session. We do encourage you to ask questions using the Q&A feature, which is located on the WebEx toolbar. We'll monitor those throughout the hour, and we'll have some time reserved at the end to answer those. Just a little background about who we are before we get started. Kirkpatrick Price is a PCI qualified security assessor and licensed CPA firm providing assurance services to clients worldwide. The firm has over 12 years of experience in information assurance by performing assessments, audits, and tests that strengthen information security and compliance controls. We offer both regulatory compliance and information security services. We provide consulting services such as policy and procedure drafting, risk assessment, internal audit plan and development, and readiness audits. We also provide guidance and audit services on frameworks such as HIPAA, SOC 1 and SOC 2, PCI DSS, FISMA, and ISO 27001 and 27002. We also encourage you to connect with us by subscribing to our blog, visiting our library of recorded webinars, and following us on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. We give a ton of important updates through social media that you don't want to miss. Now let's welcome our speaker for today, Mark Heinley. Mark is a regulatory compliance specialist with Kirkpatrick Price and a member of the Florida Bar with 9 years of experience in healthcare law, regulatory affairs, and internal compliance in the public and private sectors. His specific experiences include serving in the General Counsel's Office for the State Healthcare Oversight Agency, regulatory affairs for a Medicare, Medicaid, HMO, and complex healthcare litigation. He's also SAM certified in the law of data security and investigations. So welcome, Mark.
Thank you. And I want to extend my welcome to all of you. This is session 2 of our 3-part series of the Risk Management 101 presentations. And as good as the first one was, this one is going to be even better because now we're going to get into the meat of the work and actually talk about conducting a risk analysis. So for our goal today is to actually teach you the process of determining risk. The goal today is not to give you a complete list of potential threats and vulnerabilities that are common for HIPAA risk considerations. We are going to use some examples during the presentation to really help make it tangible. But the goal today isn't to simply give you a template of threats and vulnerabilities that you can then complete and end your risk analysis process there. The goal is to get you to think through the process of determining risk so that you can take that process to your own environments and your own organizations and conduct a thorough and complete evaluation of your own situation. And that thought process is just as valuable as the end result of a risk analysis. So just want to make that clear as we go through today's presentation. Since we are in a 3-part series, I also want to give a brief recap of last week's session, our last session, which is recorded, by the way. If you do want to listen to it, you can go to our website and look at the resources tab under webinars. You'll see the Risk Management 101 selection. So we talked about several things in terms of preparing for your risk analysis. The key to having a successful risk analysis starts at the beginning when you ensure that you have proper resources. So individuals who have enough time and experience and expertise in conducting a risk analysis, whether that's internal individuals or external solutions. And then the second part of that was the importance of defining scope. So a risk analysis can only be complete if the entire EPHI environment is evaluated. And one of the ways that you can ensure that you are including all of the relevant EPHI in your environment in the risk analysis is by creating or using your EPHI workflow, where you look at all of the ways that EPHI comes in, stays in, and goes out of your organization as a way of identifying the places where you're going to consider threats and vulnerabilities. And then finally, compiling asset lists, either creating those like the EPHI workflow or using what you already have to bolster your scoping process. So that's an important part of this process, and we're going to move forward in today's session, assuming that all of that has been done. You can still learn a lot from today. Today will be valuable to you, even if you haven't completed the planning process. So don't drop off and don't give up on us, even if you haven't completed the planning process. But just know that the discussion that we're going to share today is all on the basis that you've already completed that planning process. So as we go into today's presentation, we're going to talk about the actual elements of conducting a risk analysis for HIPAA compliance. And it's important that when we do that, we define the terms that are frequently used when you're undergoing or completing a risk analysis. 3 specific terms: vulnerability, threat, and risk. And so a vulnerability is defined in the NIST 800 series as a flaw or weakness in system security, procedures, design, implementation, or internal controls that can be exercised, either accidentally triggered or intentionally exploited, and result in a security breach or a violation of the system's security policy. So when I talk about vulnerabilities today, we're talking about flaws or weaknesses in your system. The second term we're going to use is the term threat, and that's defined as the potential for a person or thing to exercise, again, accidentally trigger or intentionally exploit a specific vulnerability. And again, this is adapted definition from the NIST 800 series. So the vulnerability is this thing that exists out there waiting for something to accidentally or intentionally trigger it or act upon the vulnerability. And then the threat is the thing that specifically acts upon that vulnerability. There's a relationship between the concepts of threat and vulnerability. And then our third and perhaps most important definition is the definition of risk. And this is taken from the HHS Guidance for Risk Analysis, which is a useful publication that you can find on the HHS webpage. The definition is: risk can be understood as a function of 1, the likelihood of a given threat triggering or exploiting a particular vulnerability, and 2, the resulting impact on the organization. This means that risk is not a single factor or event, but rather is a combination of factors or events, threats and vulnerabilities that, if they occur, may have an adverse impact on the organization. Depending on your experience with risk analysis and the concept of risk, this may seem like a little bit confusing at first, but I'm confident that as we go through our presentation today, you'll see this idea, at least get the foundation of this idea, that risk is going to be understood as a combination of factors. And to do that, we're going to start off, before we get into the technical approach to risk analysis, we're going to talk about the concept of risk being subjective. And I want to go through a non-HIPAA, non-healthcare related example to share this concept, to explain this concept. So when we're going through the nature of risk, we're asking, what is the asset? What are we trying to protect for? What do we need to protect? And is there significant risk? So what you're looking at now on your screen is a picture of a worn tire. And you can see that the tread is worn down in several places and it's completely smooth. So if you just saw the picture of the tire and you had to ask yourself, is there significant risk? And you might say, well, that looks like a tire that's in really bad shape. So I think that there's significant risk there. But if we can go to the next slide, if you see that risk or that tire is being used on a swing instead of a car, then you might change your opinion about the nature of the risk related to that tire. For a car that's carrying yourself or your family, a worn tire like that might be something that'd be completely unacceptable in terms of risk. But as a tire swing, it might work out great. So you can see that this combination of factors comes into play when you're seeing the asset, not just as it is, but the way that it's used. So we maybe changed our opinion of the risk from that tire when we thought of it potentially being used on a car, and then now that we see it's being used as a tire swing. Well, what if the rope on that tire swing was frayed like the rope in the picture in front of you? Well, then would you alter and increase your opinion about the nature of risk in this scenario again. So now we've moved from one part of the consideration, the tire, to something that the tire is connected to, now the rope. So we might have gone from total risk to zero risk back to really high risk again, seeing that there's only one strand connecting the pieces of rope. Well, now that we've thought about that, what if there was a control in place? What if there was a group of individuals with this rescue trampoline underneath the girl on the tire swing? Now, is the risk reduced enough based on this new piece of information? And then just to make it even more complicated, what if those individuals who were holding that rescue trampoline were somehow standing over a canyon like the one pictured before you? Would that then again change your perspective on risk? So you see, we kind of took probably a roller coaster of risk through this, starting out with the idea, well, a worn tire, it looks like there's risk. And then we moved to the tire swing, and then the rope, and then the net, or the trampoline, and then the trampoline being over the Grand Canyon. And the lesson from this is that until you have all the information about the assets you're trying to protect, the threats and the risk and your controls, you do not have a full understanding of the risk in your environment. So that's lesson number one. Then the implicit lesson number two is that you know how to do this. So one of the things I want you to go away from this session knowing is you are capable of identifying risk, you're capable of identifying threats, you're capable of identifying vulnerabilities, you're capable of identifying controls, and you're capable of evaluating all the information about the assets you're trying to protect and coming up with a reasonable ranking of that risk. You just did it. I'm confident that everyone just did that with the tire swing example. It may be a little bit more difficult and maybe new to you when we go through some of the requirements with respect to EPHI. But everyone is capable of understanding the nature of risk and controls and protection. So as you go through your risk analysis, it's important that you not define your risk until the very end, and we'll talk about that. It's also important that you understand you do have the capability of completing this task. All right, so now that we've talked about the subjective nature of risk, let's get into some of the more technical elements. There are numerous risk analysis methods. I've listed just 3 here, and HIPAA doesn't require, the security rule doesn't require a specific risk analysis method. NIST is probably the most common in the United States. The Mehari and Magerit methods are European methods, so they're far less common, especially probably in the healthcare field. They might be a little bit more common in some of the information, some other information and data security fields. But the most common method is probably the NIST 800 series. But either way, these 3 different examples of risk analysis methods really are very similar. And using the NIST elements, they all contain these aspects, these key elements. The first is to identify the potential threats and vulnerabilities. The second is to determine the likelihood of the threat occurrence. The third is to determine the potential impact of the threat occurrence. The fourth is to evaluate current controls. The fifth is determine level of risk. And then the last and final element is to finalize documentation. So these are the steps that all of them are key to completing a HIPAA risk analysis that's consistent with the standards and expectations within the security rule. So we're going to go through these elements, particularly the first 5 of these elements, and we'll talk a little bit about documentation today, but we'll talk more about documentation in our final session of this Risk Management 101 series. So the first step in completing a risk analysis is to identify your potential threats and vulnerabilities. And this is why the planning part of the process is so important. It's much easier to identify potential threats and vulnerabilities if you have the scope of your environment, if you have an EPHI workflow, and if you have asset lists to tell you where your potential threats and vulnerabilities exist. And when you have those documents, when you have those individuals and resources, the process involves just asking questions over and over and over again. What could happen to these different parts of our environment that contain electronic PHI. So let's use a couple of examples that we're going to carry through, at least one of these examples, we're going to carry through each of these steps and show you how it should look at the end. So for example, if you have ePHI on laptops and you have laptops on your asset list, you say, okay, what kind of threats and vulnerabilities could we experience in a laptop, in a workstation? So one example is a vulnerability could be a careless employee. Well, then what would the threat be to act on that vulnerability? Well, the laptop could be lost or stolen if the employee, one of the frequent examples that's resulted in enforcement action is that a laptop that's left at a restaurant or a hotel or in a rental car or something like that. And because the employee was careless, there was the vulnerability, and the threat is someone acts upon that vulnerability, that carelessness, and they take the laptop. Another example is an online portal. So you could have a portal in this case where a patient accesses ePHI. The vulnerability could be that your firewall is improperly configured to have an allow all rule. And the threat that could act upon that firewall is an unauthorized host gaining access using a denial of service attack. So you see when you go through these different you're looking at your different aspects of your ePHI workflow and your asset list, you're going to ask these questions over and over again. And for laptops and patient portals, you're going to have likely multiple threats and vulnerabilities and controls as we get to those that you'll have to explore and evaluate. So that's why I say it's important to ask the questions over and over and over again. It's not just to ask that question for each of your areas of your workflow and your asset list. It's to ask those questions over and over and over again with each of those things multiple times until you feel like you've exhausted all the potential threats and vulnerabilities within reason. So now that we've identified a potential threat and vulnerability for the laptop, the second part of the process involves determining the likelihood of the threat. This means you're determining the probability that a potential vulnerability is actually exercised. So for this laptop example, what's the likelihood? So just because something exists in theory doesn't mean it's actually going to happen, or it could mean it's very likely that it happens. And part of the risk analysis process is figuring out that sense of likelihood. And so a couple of questions that you might ask if you're thinking through the process with this laptop example is, well, how many laptops do we have? If you have one, then the likelihood of a threat occurrence being acted on is much less than if you had 1,000. So, the number of an item or an asset impacts the likelihood of a threat occurrence. Are laptops ever allowed to leave, your organization's physical facility? If your policies prohibit that kind of activity, then your likelihood of a threat occurrence being acted on is much lower than if you had people using their laptops in personal and professional situations that were outside of your physical facility. Well, not only do you have to worry about your laptops leaving your physical facility, but you have to ask, do your employees use their own laptops to access ePHI? So the likelihood of a threat occurrence is much greater if people are using their own laptops, which are probably not configured to the standards of your organization, or potentially more vulnerable than the laptops that you have the ability to configure on your own. And then a fourth question, just in this example, is ePHI stored on laptops? So the potential for a vulnerability to be exercised is much greater if there's ePHI on that laptop, as opposed to that laptop just being a mechanism by which an individual can access ePHI. So, as I said, if you only had one laptop and it was never allowed to leave the building, then you'd probably have a very low likelihood of a successful threat occurrence. Now, once you go through that process of evaluating the likelihood of a threat occurrence, you need to have a key and a ranking system, and that's going to be the same for several of these other required elements. So, for example, a very simple key would be a 1 is a very low likelihood of occurrence, a 2 is a low likelihood of occurrence, a 3 is represents a moderate likelihood of occurrence, a 4 equals a high likelihood of occurrence, and a 5 equals a very high likelihood of occurrence. And this gives you a numeric representation of the likelihood of a threat. And this will be useful as we examine the nature of risk being the combination of multiple different factors. So we've identified that you have an asset in a laptop. We've identified potential threats and vulnerabilities, and now we've determined the level of likelihood that a threat could occur. The next step in the process is determining the potential impact of a threat occurrence. So just because something is very likely to occur doesn't mean that its overall impact on your organization would be that bad. Or just because something is very low in terms of likelihood of occurrence doesn't mean that its potential impact is low as well. There's an additional consideration. And just like with the likelihood element, you're going to rank numerically with a key the potential impact of a threat occurrence. So if we use this laptop example, how much EPHI could be accessed from the lost or stolen laptop? And if that laptop was accessed and EPHI was accessed on that laptop, could that shut down operations? Would that prevent your organization from operating for a brief or more extended period of time? Could that situation impact other covered entities or business associates? So how far does this extend beyond, the impact extend beyond your own organization? Could this cause a loss of business? Would clients, existing clients leave? Would potential clients balk at engaging your services if this threat occurrence happened? And then another question is, what kind of impact would that have to your reputation? Would this be something where your organization would be viewed as careless and dangerous to work with, or would this be something that would have maybe just a minor harm and be considered a regular part of doing business, and there wouldn't be any real adverse impact on reputation? So using this laptop example again, if your laptop was lost and that was the only way of accessing EPHI, then you might not be able to operate. But if you had other methods of accessing that EPHI other than that single laptop, then that might not shut down your operations. And if you didn't have any EPHI on that device, well then that might mean that no EPHI could be accessed. And if there was only one patient's EPHI that was available on that device, you might say, well, then there's a very low impact to our organization if this threat occurrence is acted upon. And so then you would take your key and say, okay, very low impact, that means a 1. So now we've got a score, a ranking from our likelihood, what's the probability that something occurs, and then you've got a ranking for your potential impact. What would be the consequences to your organization if, no matter the likelihood, what would be the consequences to your organization if the threat occurrence was acted on? All right, now that you've ranked your likelihood and your potential impact, you're going to go back to kind of a more substantive evaluation to talk about, from the example of our rope swing, the safety net underneath the child swinging on the tire swing. So we're talking about the use of your assets and your EPHI and your backup measures to prevent a threat occurrence and a vulnerability from being exploited. So for this laptop example, this is a situation where you're simply going to list all of the controls that are currently in place to prevent the specific threat and vulnerability from being exploited. So if you've got 6 or 7 different threats and vulnerabilities related to a single laptop, you want to make sure that your controls that you're listing in this segment are specific to the threat and the vulnerability. So in this case, we talked about a careless employee losing or having a laptop stolen. So what controls might an organization have in place to reduce the risk of unauthorized access in that case? Well, they could have encryption on the laptop. They could have a unique user ID to prevent individuals from easily accessing the information on the laptop. They could require a VPN to access ePHI that's not located on the laptop. They could require multi-factor authentication to make access more difficult. They could have a remote wipe tool, which would allow the organization, once it determines that the laptop has been lost or stolen, to immediately clean and swipe all the information, ePHI and otherwise, on the laptop to reduce the risk of unwanted or unauthorized exposure. They can prevent, an organization can prevent ePHI from being stored on the computer at all, only allowing remote access to ePHI. The organization could prevent laptops from being removed from a physical location in the first place. If you can't take a laptop on a trip with you, you can't, you're much less likely to leave it in a hotel or a rental car. Or, they'd say you can't access ePHI remotely. You can use this laptop, you can use it to access ePHI. That ePHI won't be stored on the computer itself, but you can only use it to access that ePHI within the physical facility. So those are some just examples of controls to reduce the likelihood and impact of a threat occurrence. Now, like the other examples, you're going to rank your controls, and just a simple way of doing it would be insufficient, sufficient, and excellent, or some other, depending on how much nuance and information you want, you can create your own rating system to determine whether or not you believe the controls that are in place would prevent, how well would they prevent the threat occurrence and the vulnerability from being exploited. And then while you're going through this, it just makes sense to identify control recommendations. We're going to talk about these in our final session in this series, but just ask yourself, what else can we do to mitigate risk? So I just listed off, almost 10 controls for reducing the likelihood of a laptop being that was lost or stolen being a part of a breach. Then you might ask yourself, is there anything else that we can do to reduce the risk of unauthorized access? And you want to document those as well, so you can see both what you have in place and what are some other options to further mitigate risk. So now that you've identified the potential threats and vulnerabilities, the likelihood of a threat or vulnerability being acted upon, the impact of that threat and vulnerability, and the control measures in place to reduce unauthorized access, you now have kind of the outcome. This is where we get to kind of the answer to our equation. So the level of risk, and it's specifically in this case, we're talking about residual risk. Residual risk is the risk after you have evaluated the controls in place and the likelihood and the impact. You're going to come up with a numerical score. That's the very minimum that you should do when you're conducting risk analysis, is to come up with a numerical score similar to the low, very low, low, moderate, high, or very high, that kind of numeric ranking. If you would like to take your risk analysis to the next level and provide yourself with further information about the nature of your risks, you can also categorize your risks. So this is a non-numeric ranking, but it groups your risk based on the specific aspects of that risk. So I provided 5 categories. There are innumerable number of potential categories. So you could have risk that is reputational. You could have regulatory compliance risk. What is the likelihood that a state or the federal government would issue fines or sanctions, corrective action plans, because of an exposure, threat, and a vulnerability being acted upon? What is the operational, does this have operational risk to it? Does it have technical risk to it? Does it have financial risk? So these would be categories that I would determine as helpful but not necessary to complete your risk analysis. But they do give you a fuller picture of the type of risk that you have and the areas where you have the greatest risk. It just gives you another piece of information. So the next step is we're going to show you an example of what this process might look like using this laptop example. So this would be a what I would say, a fairly brief documentation of the risk analysis. I've seen some that have less information, but really good risk analysis will have even more information. They'll have, like I talked about, they'll have more descriptions about the assets or names. They'll categorize the risk, they'll categorize the controls, they'll categorize the impact and the likelihood, and you can go as much as you want in providing additional elements. But at the very least, this would give you a basic risk analysis. So you see that the asset is the laptop, the threat is a careless employee, the vulnerability is that the laptop is lost, and then based on only having, in this case, only having one laptop, and that laptop's not allowed to leave a physical facility, we determined that the likelihood of this vulnerability being exercised or exploited was very low. And then again, because we only have one laptop, it doesn't have any EPHI on it, we determined that the impact to our organization would be very low. And then we listed a few of we listed our current controls. So we have encryption on the laptop, we have multi-factor authentication, and then we prevent EPHI from being stored on the device. And that's what we have in place at the moment. And so we said that our control ratings at the moment were sufficient to manage the risk, which was very low in terms of likelihood and very low in terms of impact. And then as a result, we determined that our residual risk, the combination of the likelihood, the impact, and the current control rating was low. And then at the very end, we documented some control recommendations. We think it'd be good to explore or implement a remote wipe tool and to prevent employees from using personal laptops to access EPHI. So that's a lot of information in about half of an hour, and want to kind of wrap this up and give you guys a chance to ask some questions because this is like I said, a lot of information. So takeaways from today's presentation are establishing the framework of key elements. That last slide was a good visual of the basics of those key elements: identifying the assets, identifying the threats, identifying the vulnerabilities, the likelihood, impact, current controls, control rating, your risk, and your recommendations. If you're missing, to the extent that you're missing those key elements, it impacts not only your ability to assess the risk properly, and using our tire swing example, to know, well, you might have your risk listed as high if you don't know the controls that are in place, or you might have your risk ultimately ranked as low because you think your controls are in place without realizing that there are some potential vulnerabilities to those controls and not just to EPHI. So not only is it important to have all of those elements to be able to properly assess your risk, but from just a regulatory compliance perspective, you put yourself at risk, no pun intended, to regulatory sanctions. And in preparing for the phase 2 of the OCR audits, in some of our discussions with the OCR, we looked at some of the risk analysis from phase 1, and one of the common findings wasn't just that people weren't understanding risk analysis, but they were doing summaries. They were providing summaries of risk analysis. And so it was impossible to know whether they'd actually conducted one and just provided a summary, or they didn't understand what a risk analysis was in the first place, and they just described the process. So we saw documentation where organizations described the fact that they reviewed their systems, they thought about potential threats and vulnerabilities, they thought about the likelihood of occurrence, and they determined that their risk was a certain level. But they never actually demonstrated at the asset level that they had evaluated the risk. So there's two important reasons to have that framework of key elements. One is for your own organization to properly understand its risk, which is the ultimate goal. And then the second is to satisfy the regulatory requirement of OCR expectations. My next recommendation or takeaway from this presentation is to start simple. If this process seems overwhelming, I hope that the tire swing example gave you some confidence that you're able to process risk and likelihood and impact and controls. And if you don't have a lot of experience in conducting a risk analysis, start with the easiest threats and vulnerabilities to both understand and also to evaluate. Those typically would be things like your physical security for your facility, things like locks on doors and security cameras and bag readers and security personnel and guest log and those kinds of things. People can see and process fairly easily outside of understanding what HIPAA is looking for, the concept of physical security. So you might want to start with things like physical security if this process seems difficult, and then build from there, moving on to things that are a little bit more, that feel less tangible. And then understand the subjective nature of risk. So if you're going through this process with multiple individuals, you may have different perspectives on the nature of risk, not only the end result, the residual risk, but the different elements that comprise that residual risk outcome. You might have individuals who think that the likelihood of something occurring is incredibly low, and other individuals on that same threat and vulnerability think that the likelihood of occurrence is very high. So it's important in going into this process and knowing that if you're going to work with a group of people, or ultimately you should be presenting this to a group of people at your organization, that there is going to be the potential to disagree on the nature of risk. And then the fourth thing is to document everything. All along the way, you're going to be able to make your case more credible, your analysis more objective and more thorough, if you document everything from the get-go. And document, as I said, in a way that explains everything rather than in just summary format. You'll be able to use the risk analysis, as we'll talk about in our next presentation, in much greater efficacy if you really documented it. So those are some of the takeaways from today's presentation. And now I want to open it up to see if anybody has any questions.
Yes, please use the Q&A tool in the WebEx toolbar if you have any questions. And I'm just going to reiterate that you will get a copy of the slides and a recording by the end of this week in your email. Let's start off with a question from Stephanie. Can you suggest references beyond the NIST document to help seed the brainstorm when trying to identify threats and vulnerability pairs?
So there are some online tools that have been put out there by the OCR. There's a software tool that can walk you through the risk analysis process, and then there are also some publications that are useful for thinking about a risk analysis. Another thing is this is a kind of a back-end way of looking at it, but look at enforcement activities. We talked about it last week, or excuse me, I keep saying that, our last presentation. We talked about some specific cases where organizations were cited for having a risk analysis. And that ultimately wasn't the issue that brought the OCR to their organization. It was something else that occurred. And in the process of investigating the issue, it was a frequent occurrence that the organization hadn't conducted either a recent risk analysis or a thorough risk analysis. So looking at enforcement activities will give you also a sense of common threats and vulnerabilities. So the online software tool, the publications, and enforcement activities would be three sources to assist you in your efforts.
And we do have a recorded webinar online of recent enforcement activity, just as another resource. Another question, Mark, are there some guidelines as to determining the level of threat versus just stating low, medium, or high?
So that's going to be, there are some, if you look in NIST, that will provide you with some some assistance. If you do that on your own, it's important that you document kind of the guidelines for what, in your key, it's beyond just pairing a number with, the number 1 with very low and the number 5 with very high. It would be explaining the reasons, the factors that go into that: financial impact, regulatory impact, operational impact, those kinds of things. So if you're going to go beyond using NIST or one of the other risk analysis methods and doing it kind of on your own, you just want to make sure that you've explained why, what constitutes a very low risk. Is it less than $10,000 financial impact, very low likelihood of regulatory compliance picture, those kind of things, just making sure that's documented so that someone could say, okay, I see that you said it's low, but how did you know that it was low, and how did your organization come to the determination that it was low?
We have another question. How successful have organizations been using the OCR software tool when they were audited?
I have limited ability to share my answer on that. I can say that I think just from a personal perspective that there's value in the tool. There's not only the tool itself, but there's some information connected to the tool on the administrative safeguards, the technical safeguards, and the physical safeguards to help you. I would say that the organizations that use those tools are probably going to come out a lot farther ahead than organizations that try to do it on their own and didn't have the kind of framework that the tool provides. Don't intend to be vague, but there's limited I can say about that.
Yeah. Another question says, ours is not a team of software developers. How deep do we have to go in the analysis of an application and still be able to demonstrate that we made a good faith effort to assess it?
That's a good question. So I don't think you have to be software developers to properly assess the risk of a software application. One of the easiest ways would be to ask the developers themselves. If it's a tool that you've bought off the shelf or a proprietary piece of software, there should be information on what those organizations who've developed the software have done to reduce the risk of the software being exploited. So I would suspect that there's information already out there from the software developer to give you a sense of they may even be able to give you at least a brief list of potential threats and vulnerabilities plus current controls. The next step, though, is you use that software at your organization, and the way that you use that software, the means by which it's accessed might be different than another organization. So one part is knowing the specific threats and vulnerabilities to a software tool, and at a certain level, those are sort of common. Too many user permissions, users who have access to the software who don't work for your company anymore. Those kinds of things. So those are common no matter what application you're talking about. But then you also have to consider your own organization's use of that software. So is that software stored on a workstation that doesn't have password protection and that is near the entrance of your physical facility that anybody could walk up to and access? So I hope that answers the question. There's kind of the software part and then each organization's use of that software. So to understand the software, I would recommend going to the provider and asking them for some information about potential threats and vulnerabilities and controls put in place by the developer to reduce the risk of the threats and vulnerabilities.
Okay. What is considered sufficient documentation by the OCR if management decides to accept a risk?
That's hard to answer because it's that's a really specific and case-by-case situation, my recommendations would be to document the decision making about that to the extent as much, the more information the better, that we accept the risk, and that we'll talk about accepting and rejecting risk and in our next presentation. But it would involve some explanation or summary or description of the reasoning behind the management's decision to accept the risk. I've never seen an organization provide too much information on that aspect.
Okay. We're getting some great feedback on the tire swing example. Do you have any more examples of threats and vulnerabilities?
Yeah, so we have, you think about, I've got a couple, like physical facility. Let's start with that one since I said that was simple. So a vulnerability could be you have insufficient HVAC capabilities. So your heating and cooling unit is not up to speed, and your threat could be that as a result of an insufficient HVAC capability, you could have overheating of key systems because you're in inclement weather. I happen to be based in Florida, and the likelihood of a lot of heat is constant. So that is a situation where we add a piece of information, and it's important that key systems be placed in a part of your facility or in a data center that has capable HVAC information. An entity that's in a different geographic location than Florida might have other considerations. If you're located next to a river, or I'm in the Tampa area, and I in formal professional opportunities working with a healthcare organization that was right on the water, their business continuity considerations had to be significantly different from a hurricane and flooding perspective than an organization that's in Kansas. So some of your physical facility examples to give you kind of the common thread there, and then also to give you some variation within the geographic distances. Another example, though, so we talked about software, a workstation application. If you have a lot of dormant accounts on there, the threat could be a careless IT personnel. They're creating insecure user management that allows for unauthorized access because dormant accounts are just left unaddressed. A server at a data center, the vulnerability could be a lack of data validation, and the threat could be malware that corrupts the EPHI. And then you have a loss of integrity in that situation. So I hope those are three more helpful examples of potential threats and vulnerabilities. All right, do we have any other questions?
Oh, I was on mute. Whoops. No other questions. Thank you guys for attending today and submitting questions. Our next webinar in this series will be using your risk analysis a month from today, March 28th. And that registration is available online, and this recording will be emailed to you by the end of the week. So I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.